On day 65 of our journey of 66 and 26, we come to the shortest book of the Bible we've read so far, and that is the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. We also come to a breath of fresh air, quite honestly. As we've been reading through much of the Old Testament so far, we see a lot of selfishness, we see a lot of corruption and faithlessness. But here in the book of Ruth, we see example after example of noble character, of men and women who are serving and thinking of others instead of self. And we could spend a lot of time and extra videos just talking about this story of Ruth and unpacking the depths and the richness of this story. But we're reading the whole book of Ruth in one day. And maybe one of the most important things we should know is in the ancient world, the hardship for widows. Because this really is a story that is about a particular widow, two of them actually, Naomi and Ruth. Naomi is the wife of a man from the tribe of Judah living around the land of Bethlehem, who leaves Bethlehem and leaves Judah, the promised land, in order to find provision for his family, his wife and his two sons, because there's a famine in the land, and they go to the land of Moab, and they're able to settle there for some time. And his sons even take wives who are Moabite women in Moab. And when they're in the land of Moab, then Naomi's husband dies, and then the two sons also die. Now, in the ancient world, you have to understand that if a woman's husband was not able to advocate for her, and she didn't have any sons to advocate for her, then she had nobody who could officially, publicly, legally advocate for her, and she wasn't allowed to work and provide money for herself or any of her other family. And so she was in desperate need, and she's determined to go back to her homeland, to the land of Judah, to Bethlehem. And she insists that her daughters-in-law return to their own families. But Ruth demonstrates a servant heart, a noble character, and she insists, Naomi, I'm not going to leave you, and God forbid that I would leave your side. And she travels back, even though she's a foreigner, she goes into the land of Judah. And because she's a younger woman than Naomi, she volunteers herself to go out into the fields to glean. Now, gleaning is a technical term that is a provision that God gave in the Old Testament period in his law, where he instructed the Israelites when they have fields and they harvest those fields, not to pick to the very far edges of the field and not to go through the field a second time to pick all the leftover crops or things that fell to the ground, but to leave all those at the edges and the extras that weren't picked the first time for those who are poor or those who are foreigners living in land who didn't have any other way of providing for their families to come through. And so it's really a way of taking care of the poor and the widows. And Ruth, because she's younger, volunteers to help Naomi to go through the field, and she's gleaning in the field of a man named Boaz, who is a distant relative of Naomi's. And while she's there, Boaz, the owner of the land, notices her. Now, it's important that he could very easily look down at her. He is wealthy and owns this land, and he has many servants, but he notices this foreigner, Ruth, and not only notices, but invites her to come back, because he knows that if she goes to someone else's field, she may be taken advantage of, maybe abused even. And so he invites her to come back to his fields where he knows he can take care of her needs. And then not only invites her to come back to glean at other times, but even takes some of his own effort to uproot some of the plants so that she can very easily take some of the crops without extra effort of her own, and so is serving her in that way, and then gives extra on top of that. And then there's this concept in the book of Ruth of what is known as a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer is a wealthy person who is expected to take care of relatives that could be immediate relatives or distant relatives who would be poor or who had gone into debt because of financial difficulties, and they had to sell themselves off into slavery and work for somebody at no cost. Well, that wealthier relative was expected under God's law to take care of relatives who were poor and enslaved and buy them out of slavery, or if a relative had to sell off a piece of land because of their poverty, then that kinsman redeemer would purchase that land back so it stayed in the family and stayed among the Israelites and not sold off to foreigners. And so Boaz goes out of his way to take on this role of a kinsman redeemer, even though there's someone who's a closer relative who has the duty to fill in that role. He's not willing, and so Boaz takes it upon himself and then buys Naomi's property so that she can stay there, and then also marries Ruth. And isn't it appropriate that when Boaz and Ruth marry, they have a son, and they name their son Obed, which is a Hebrew word that means servant. And it's appropriate because we see throughout this book of Ruth, this servant heart of Boaz and Ruth, who are thinking of others and generously giving of themselves for the sake of others, which is the character that God calls his people to. And even though we've seen throughout the Old Testament so many examples that are negative, bad examples of what God calls us to, and not following through, not being faithful to God's calling, here in the book of Ruth, we see an example after example of Boaz and Ruth going out of their way to give and serve. And we find out at the end of the book of Ruth that Ruth and Boaz are actually the great-grandparents of King David, which also means that they are in the line of the genealogy of Jesus. If you saw yesterday's video, you know that Jesus' genealogy at the beginning of the book of Matthew in the New Testament includes Judah and Tamar. Well, today we see that those names Boaz and Ruth also show up in the genealogy of Jesus. And so Jesus, the distant relative of Ruth and Boaz, shows himself to be willing to redeem us who are impoverished in spirit, not just financially impoverished, but spiritually impoverished. And Jesus gives himself for us to redeem us from our slavery to sin and death. And so in the book of Ruth, we see a glimmer, just a hint of that story of Jesus already right here in the Old Testament book of Ruth.